Hi.
I'm actually not done with my breakfast yet, but I'll be back. I just wanted to log in so you
Okay.
know I'm there and I can hear you.
All right, no worries. Enjoy the rest of breakfast.
Yeah, super. Thank you.
Hi, Marcus.
Hello.
Hello.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. How's it going?
Pretty good.
Yeah.
And you?
Yeah, not too bad. Yeah, good. It's so bizarre though, isn't it?
Is Christiana here as well? I don't see a live image, but
She is here. She's just finishing her breakfast though.
okay.
She's being diligent and logging in early.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
I'm just having a sugar, something to get me going late afternoon here.
Yeah, absolutely. You need something a pick-me-up to keep you going.
Exactly.
Have you been in many other panels, Marcus, so far, or like viewing?
Some, not too many. It's I've been quite preoccupied late last week, and then it's the weekend, so I've been trying to sneak things in, which is not the easiest with 3 kids around. And
Oh wow!
but I chaired a session late last evening, which was actually that was very nice.
Yeah.
It works. It worked well.
Oh, that's good.
And you? Have you been checking out the
I've been terrible. So yeah, I went to the panel that I presented at, and that was it.
Yeah.
Which is awful.
So when was this?
It was Friday night, so it was 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
UK time.
That one I was unable to go to.
Ah, wow.
But
I think the temptation with remote conferencing is definitely like I had loads of work to do, and so I've just done my work rather than I was kind of barely aware the conference was on, which is such a shame because I always find it such an interesting one to go to, and I find it quite inspiring.
No, but I think, I mean, that's what a kind of a live conference does. I mean, it takes you away from your normal context, and then you sort of commit to the conference full on, and then you have this experience. It's much more difficult when you're in your kind of normal surrounding, or when all of us are in our. But I mean, so as far as I can tell, I mean, the ones that are not live sessions only, they are recorded and will remain on some platform. So one can still watch them afterwards.
Yeah, I plan to do that over time. We'll see. Yeah. Again, sort of easy to aspire to these kind of these good habits, but we'll see. I'm just going to check my emails and see whether I've had anything from the others, because we're looking a bit sparse at the moment.
Yeah.
No, nothing so far. Oops. Cool, right. Nothing from anyone, so let's hope they turn up.
This is going to be a very exclusive session.
Yeah, absolutely. Some intense discussion. I look forward to sharing. Did you find that the sessions you were in had much in the way of audience?
So the one we had late last evening, where some 3 or 4, I think one dropped in and out. But I mean, so this was basically what I expected, more or less. And then, I mean, afterwards we had a discussion between the panelists, and so now someone arrives.
I believe that's right.
It worked. It worked well. But I mean, sometimes that does happen in a live conference as well. I mean, depending on when it is, and you know, if you're in one of these rooms on the 13th floor.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Definitely. Aha. Hello, Ali. Oh, I need to unmute you, or you can unmute you. Unmute. I should have godlike powers, but they don't seem to be working. Hello, Thompson.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm all right.
Excellent. So you're all the key people here, which is brilliant. So we can do like how it all works, but you all know by now, no doubt. So I said in the email, 15 minutes for everyone to speak. So 15 minutes per paper, and Christiana, if you want to, up to 15 minutes for discussion, if you have that much to say. But I think we can be entirely flexible given the nature of the circumstances. I'll mute everyone while papers are being delivered, apart from the speaker. Assuming I can do that, I don't seem to be able to have. I don't seem to have.
You can also just mute yourselves, you know.
Yeah, indeed. So maybe we could devolve the power to the individuals rather than me imposing. And then
Max, can I just ask something? So I wanted to share my screen, and I seem not to be able to do that. I think you need to make me co-host or something.
Yeah, right.
You can also, Max, you can also, if you go to security, you can allow participants to share screen. It's very unlikely that any of us has anything else that they want to share.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so you should be able to do that now.
I will try. Yes.
Yeah.
You want to try it out?
I can. Let's just wait a sec. I need to find what I'm looking for, which is this one.
Aha.
So can you see that?
I could see, now I can just see a line, is that right?
Okay. No, that's probably not right.
It looks very artistic.
It started right.
I'll try it again. Desktop 2.
Hi, Max. While
can you
trying to sort this thing out, this is James from LSA.
So you can see something now, can't you?
Yes, sorry, right. Yeah, I can see your unwilling or unable appendix 1.
Okay, exactly. That's good. So I'll stop sharing.
Great. Yeah, cool. So yeah, I think we'll just muddle through and it'll all be fine.
Have we got 2 honoured guests in this meeting that aren't the speakers? That's exciting that people want to hear us.
Yes, so we've got James and Alexandre. Sandy?
Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm actually from the Law and Society Association Executive Office, and I just wanted to see if you need any help with your Zoom.
Oh, I see. Thank you so much for stopping by. I think we're all right. I kind of expected it to not work very well at first, but I think it's all fine. But thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
And
And if you want to say and what,
I just wanted to chat with Tamsin. Tamsin, are you from Zimbabwe by chance?
Yes, James, I'm from Zimbabwe.
Oh, cool. Good to meet you. I'm from Zimbabwe as well. Just saw your last name and I was like, that sounds like a Zimbabwean last name.
Oh, great. Good to meet you, James.
All right, take care, guys. Enjoy your session, hey?
Thank you.
thank you. Hey Thompson, are you still in Southampton at the moment, or Portsmouth? Or it is Southampton, isn't it?
Southampton. I'm in Southampton.
Yeah. Fantastic. I asked because, as Thompson knows, I'm from Southampton, and we met in Southampton, so serious Southampton connections. Okay, we have a minute to go.
So have we established an order for the papers?
Oh yes. You're really good at nudging me to say the right things, Marcus.
It's just because I chaired yesterday, so I don't know.
Yes, so I think I'm led to believe that there is an LSA convention, which is that we'll follow the order in which they appear in the programme. So we'll have Thompson first, then we'll have Marcus, and then we'll end with Ali. And then Christiana will give us some thoughts, and then we'll have our discussion. I also think that we'll wait. Obviously, we're scheduled to start at 4 o'clock UK time, which is whatever time, 11 EST. But we'll leave it maybe to a couple of minutes past the hour, if everyone's happy with that, just to see if any latecomers arrive.
Sure.
Oh, go on, Ali.
I want
Sorry.
us to start by just saying something about who we are and where we're from.
Yeah, if you want to do that, that sounds great.
Do you think it's fair or totally horrific to ask Sandy to do the same? Because at the moment he's our only participant and I'm curious about him.
Okay,
There's something about
let's do that.
his background that doesn't agree. Just
Yeah,
I know.
suspicious.
Well, I'm Sandy Kedar. I work on, currently I do research on the occupied Palestinian territories, on the land regime, and I'm in Israel. I teach law at the University of Haifa Law School, work on indigenous people, and increasingly interested in international law. And I wrote a book on the land dispute between Israel and the Bedouins of the Negev, and there I co-authored it, but I wrote 2 chapters on whether the Bedouins are indigenous and what is the status of UNDRIP, United Nations Declaration of Indigenous People, whether it became customary international law or not, and especially issues that have to do with land.
Wow.
So I'm somehow interested in this session. But
Fantastic. Well, welcome.
But I might be in and out because it's now a bit after 6 p.m. in Israeli time, so I might have to leave and come back and so on. So I'm sorry.
No problem. All right, so let's go. We're going to go clockwise on my screen. So Marcus, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?
Okay, yes. My name is Marcus Gunnarflo. I think I met most of you, actually. I teach international law at Lund University in Sweden. Yeah, I think that's it.
Cool. Fantastic. Great to have you here. Ali, you're next clockwise on my screen.
This is pleasingly confusing for me. I was thinking, oh, I'm going to go last. I don't understand clocks, obviously. So my name is Ali Bohm. I started typing Ali Bohm into Zoom and it connected me before I could finish typing my name. So I'm a little bit mysterious in my Zoom name. I am at the University of Lincoln's Law School, lucky enough to be a colleague of Max's for, is this the 3rd year now? That we've been trying to bring together international law discussions on all things war. So thanks, Max.
Cool. And then Thompson?
Hello, everyone. My name is Thompson Chengeta. As you have picked from the tech guy, James. I'm from Zimbabwe, currently in Southampton as a European Research Council Fellow, and I work on issues of international law and AI technologies, in particular autonomous open systems. I'm very pleased to be on the panel with you guys.
Fantastic. Very pleased to have you here. And then Christiana?
Hi. Christiane Wilke. I'm in Ottawa, barely done with breakfast. And I teach in the Department of Law and Legal Studies at Carleton University. And I'm also doing a project on the visibility of civilians from airstrikes in particular, in which I'm collaborating with Max.
Awesome, great. And now since we started, we've had 2 more audience members. So Seth and Muriel, if you want to, you're welcome to introduce yourselves, as we're a small group. If you prefer not to, then you can sit quietly as audience members. I leave it up to you to unmute yourselves if you want to say anything.
Good morning, or I guess good afternoon, I guess depending where everybody is. I teach at Anna Maria College in Massachusetts in the US, and I've developed an interest in South African reconciliation issues, and particularly looking at how just war principles might have applied. It is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission essentially acknowledged a just war had been fought, and then did not in any way take that into consideration in its analysis of the post-conflict proceedings. And I'm looking at, is there a way for just war considerations to apply to, an asymmetric war where there's a just side and you know, candidly an unjust side, right? Anyhow, and I'm just at the beginning of that.
Cool, great, nice to meet you. And yeah, like I said, if Muriel and Jean are now a new person, maybe I should actually stop the introductions now in case we get a constant flow of people and we end up having no papers. Okay, yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to exercise my opinion, my prerogative. All right, so first off then, welcome everyone, a fabulous panel. Really pleased to be able to bring this together with Ali, and I'm really happy to be able to chair it and to be able to listen to all of the wisdom without having to offer any attempts at my own, really. So first of all then, we're going to hear from Thompson. As I said, we're going to have about 15 minutes per paper, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussions after that. I'm going to mute everyone and we'll have questions and all that at the end. So Thompson, take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Max. Again, warm greetings to everyone who is in this session. I think I should start already by jumping into the whole idea of violence, war, which has characterized the livelihoods or the lives of humans for a very long time. But I think maybe if I should start by referencing to what Karl Marx once said, that history is indeed denominated or dominated, so to say, by class struggles, where you find men trying to dominate men, and for the sake of, for example, of controlling the means of production. But one thing that characterized war from time immemorial is that it was an issue of human-to-human affair. It was violence between human and human, where individuals were facing each other. That's why when you look, for example, at the issues of just war theory, the issues of honor among soldiers, it was considered, for example, an issue that originated or that concerned, so to say, humans versus humans, so to say. Nevertheless, with the advent of technology, for example, I would want to start with reference to armed drones. The way violence has been projected has become different. We have moved in an era where you find drone pilots far removed from the battlefield are able to project violence on their victims, so to say, without necessarily being in the battlefield, without necessarily putting their own lives in danger, without necessarily putting their own morality, their own honor on danger, so to say. But on the horizon, which is the topic of my discussion today, what are known as autonomous weapon systems, which others call killer robots. And they define them as robotic weapons, which once activated are able to make the decision as to who to target without any human intervention. And when you look at these topics, at these killer robots, which is the topic, my topic today, I'm going to discuss with you. If I may check, maybe before I continue, is everyone seeing my screen?
Yeah, I can see it.
Yes.
The topic today being a case of veiled racial and religious discrimination, examining the nature of autonomous weapon systems. In essence, my questioning or my examination being whether these robotic weapons, which you once activate them, are able to make the decision as to who to target or who to harm without any human control, may be veiling or may be associated with racial and religious discrimination. Nevertheless, before I do that, I want to just give a background to this issue of autonomous weapon systems. It has been discussed from various standpoints, so to say. For example, in referral to the issue of state obligations, there have been scholars, for example, who say that killer robots or autonomous weapon systems are illegal weapons per se, meaning to say that they cannot be used in compliance with international law, or they're indiscriminate in nature, so to say. And there have been arguments to, or questions as to whether the current legal reviews as provided for in Article 36 of Additional Protocol 1 is sufficient actually to deal with this kind of weapons. And my conclusions in my research has been to say that perhaps we need to add other standards as far as the review of this new weapon is concerned. There have also been arguments on the issue of on the use of this particular weapon, that they will violate, for example, international humanitarian law, principles such as distinction, to say that because these weapons do not have the necessary situational awareness, they may not be able to comply with those rules of international humanitarian law. They may not be able to comply with rules such as proportionality, which requires qualitative judgments on the part of soldiers who are participating. They may not be able to take the necessary precautions. For example, someone may say, you are only allowed to target an individual as long as they are participating in hostilities. Once they are injured or they've become hostile combat by virtue of their wounds or by virtue of them not being able to carry on, you are not supposed to continue targeting them. The question has been asked whether these robotic weapons have that situational awareness to be able to see whether a person is no longer participating in hostilities, and many have doubts regards that. There also has been questions where people say that in the event that these weapons violate, these laws that govern the armed conflict, or in the case that they are used in law enforcement situation, they violate these principles on the use of force. Who becomes responsible? There's been a worry that there can be a creation of what others would refer to as the accountability gap, where the violation, the right to a remedy of individuals who are affected by the use of these weapons may end up being affected. So these are some of the general discussions which people have been actually discussing, especially within the United Nations. Another important aspect, or as a way of background, which has been discussed, regards the issue of ethics associated with the development and use of autonomous weapon systems. There being arguments to say the use of these particular weapons will lead in particular to the violation of important ethical standards such as the right to dignity, that it is undignified, for example, to allow a machine to make the decision as to who lives and who dies. So these are some of the important aspects that have already been highlighted. Lately, there have been already people who started, giving a perception to say, what does gender have to do with the development and use of autonomous weapon systems, the possible violation of already norms and principles relating to gender? The parts, which is the cause of the subject of my discussion today, which is yet to be fully explored, regards the issue of possible racial and religious discrimination associated with the development of these particular weapons. For me to go into this particular discussion, I wanted to start by sort of giving you a story, maybe, or a sort of a background for you maybe to understand where I'm coming from. This story, maybe in me telling it, you formulate certain opinions which perhaps will help when we come to the discussion part of my presentation. So here I'm saying perception, technology, and discrimination. And I'm saying the first imagination is that try to imagine that, you know, there is a fighter X who, for example, has killed over 300 people and is considered 300 people he considers to be enemies. And with each passing day, fighter X continues to kill more, and he is high ranking in his organization, so to say. Secondly, fighter X is considered that fighter X is married, and he has 3 kids, 1 boy and 2 girls. After months of strategizing and searching, using facial recognition and killer robots, enemies of fighter X finally locate him on a Sunday morning in a local shop as he is having coffee with his kids. There are 26 civilians in that particular shops. The killer robots, so to say, without human control, target fighter X and release a Hellfire missile, killing him along with his family and 26 civilians in the shop. And because it is programmed to kill fighter X anyway, this particular killer robot is programmed to kill him wherever it can be able to find fighter X, as long as the number of civilians who are killed remain under 30. The question being, is this acceptable, or do you consider this to be proportional? Lastly, this is where I come to the aspect of questions. But who is fighter X? Is it a member of an armed group? When I was telling this story, what came to your mind? Who is fighter X? Is he a member of an armed group in a coffee shop somewhere in Yemen? Or is fighter X a killer robot operator or programmer somewhere in Starbucks in New York? Does the answer to these questions, ascertaining the identity of fighter X, change the consideration of what is proportional or what you consider to be acceptable? Does the value of human life, in particular of civilians, change depending on the identity or the location of a particular person? When you consider that, I come now to where I say our lived experiences, you know, our fears, you know, affect how we view certain technologies that are coming into regard. And here, I wanted to start by the fact that when you are looking at the aspect of killer robots, history indeed matters. Because in the development of weapon systems, so to say, in the history of use of force, there's been already others who have argued clearly that there's been discrimination, for example, which was associated with the use of crossbow arrows. This is as far as the 12th century is concerned, where, for example, you had the Pope saying that it was okay for the use of crossbow arrows against non-Christians, but, you know, against Christians it was kind of prohibited. And some have actually written extensively on the issue of weapons of mass destruction, where there have been arguments to say the development or the deployment, so to say, of these weapons of mass destructions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the use of them in Holocaust were largely influenced or characterized, so to say, by racial discrimination, by religious differences, so to say. And when we refer to all this aspect, that in the history of weapons and the use of force, we have experiences of racial and religious discrimination taking part. This kind of informs our current fears, where we're seeing the presence of discrimination in the current use of force. Police brutality, discriminatory uses of armed drones, where you see they've been only deployed in the Muslim world, for example, where you have these same terrorists we suspected, they have not been deployed, for example, in European countries or in the US itself, unless someone belongs to a particular religious groups. If you look at even at the current brutalities which are going on in the law enforcement systems, in the system itself, this present kind of discriminatory practices kind of informs then the fears which other individuals or people of color or people belonging to certain religious groups have as far as killer robots is concerned. Where this fear is coming from, I would want to mention that, you know, as far as fear is concerned, in the history, and development of weapons or use of force, so to say, and the security dilemma, there's already been talk about, you know, the role of fear, for example, and how it is perverse in human interaction. And the debate on killer robots in this regard is no exception. So when we discuss these things, we need, in a way, to understand that fear of repetition of harm neither begins with the technology itself, in this case, killer robots, nor with the politics of killer robots or autonomous weapon systems. Fear begins in biology, my biology, so to say, my identity and my lived experiences. So as people of color, fear is not only an emotion, it is a flashpoint of our psychic lives as influenced by our lived experience. Our reaction to this, to the killer robots debate, so to say, and the fear thereof is caused by a sense of danger experienced in the past, danger experienced in the present, and the possible danger in the future. That danger, whether some of the people who may be participating in this debate may consider it real or imagined, you know, that danger threatens to kill us, to harm us, to harm the things we value and our freedom from pain by presenting other technological methods that will perpetuate that pain. How do those technological methods perpetuate that pain or that fear of discrimination? Because the question which we ask is that there is possible discrimination in the design and developmental stage of these killer robots. We ask questions such as, who is designing these killer robots? What is the data which is being used to train these machines? Already there have been proof to say that certain algorithms better identify or correctly identify white males. When they are used, for example, on Black population, there's misidentification. Yet we see that those same algorithms are the ones which are used, for example, in signature strikes. Signature strikes being the development of a certain characteristic that if a person looks like this or if a person behaving like this is means they are a legitimate target. And we, there is a concern therefore where others ask the historical prejudices which already exist, will not the same prejudices find their way into the current development or programming of these algorithms which are used in killer robots, so to say. There have been a number of examples where, for example, people, I think there was a Microsoft bot which was once uploaded, and within a few hours of it being on Twitter, it was already racist. So the question, when people are talking about transparency as to who is developing them and who will field them, the question is, if the person is already prejudiced against a certain or against certain people, so to say, you will find that the killer robots will only make worse this issue of discrimination. And there's also discrimination in the use or development of deployment of killer robots. This is where we ask as to who is deploying these killer robots and where are they deploying them and against who? You know, where are they likely to be deployed? And in my understanding, we will say that the development of killer robots is more of a further development of armed drones. And I've already mentioned that the armed drones have only been used in Muslim wars against certain people of a particular religion. And armed drones have been regarded, for example, as a weapon of choice against anti-terror missions, so to say. So when we, for example, people of color and other people from religions regard these particular weapons, the question is, they're being made for who and where would they be deployed? I am sorry to say that when I think of killer robots, the question becomes, can one imagine them being deployed in London, being deployed in New York? The question or the response is perhaps unlikely. So it is perhaps people who have always been on the side or on the receiving end of this kind of violence who will be victims, so to say. But that's not the end of it. The question also becomes at the discrimination after use of the killer robots. I've already mentioned the aspect that there is a likelihood of these killer robots creating what is known as an accountability gap. Who becomes responsible when certain rights, certain laws have been violated? And in this question, if you look at the violations of many drone victims, so to say, what has been the response of the international community? of many wars that have been happening in certain regions where these weapons are likely to be developed? Has there been accountability? The answer to me, as far as I'm concerned, is no. Where you find particular states say, we'll deal with our own citizens, but yet there is no follow-up, or there is no actual holding of account of those people who participated in the violation of those rights. And lastly, I'm trying to keep within my time, is the sixth form of this discrimination, where I say there may be discrimination in the policy discussions on killer robots. You know, people of color are people from these particular regions who are discussing these killer robots, well represented within the expert discussions happening at the international level. And when I'm saying at the international level, I'm particularly referring, for example, within the United Nations. Let me start by just telling you just this story. Years back, I worked as a senior researcher for the UN Special Rapporteur and extrajudicial executions, and I participated in the researching and drafting of the 2013 report on lethal autonomous weapon systems. It was this report which introduced the topic of autonomous weapon systems or killer robots within the United Nations, where this debate started about whether, how to respond to this particular issue. And my PhD is actually also in the same field, so to say, on international law and autonomous weapon systems. That's what I've been working on for the past 12 years or so. And yet, when the discussions were starting about a few years ago, when the discussions was in the United Nations CCW, and we are discussing about what are the possible policy options, and the UN was inviting experts to discuss their views as far as this issue is concerned. I had a conversation with one gentleman who was representing a certain delegation, and his idea, and I was questioning this idea of gender balance and issue of racial balance on the panel experts who were being continuously invited to come and give views on this issue. I asked them specifically why they were not women or no people of color on those particular panel, and their response was, you know, the thing is, I don't think there are many, perhaps, people of color who are experienced or who have expertise in this idea. And to me, the funny part was, okay, so we participated in the introduction of this whole issue to begin with within the UN, and you are saying that you do not have experts who are belonging to people of color. So the idea of, like, when we are formulating these policies, where are they being formulated? Who are likely to be affected? Are they involved in these discussions? This is where the part where I perhaps think there may be exclusion already, or some of the concerns of people from certain religious backgrounds, from certain race, that are already excluded in how to respond to this technology, which of course is going to have far-reaching consequences for humanity, so to say. I would want to end on that note and thank you panelists and everyone who may be participating. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Thompson. What a really, really interesting paper there. Let's move swiftly on so that we don't overrun. Marcus, are you ready to share your screen?
I'm not going to share the screen immediately. So
okay.
That will be towards the end.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool. Take it away.
Thank you. My title is Anti-Colonialism is Self-Defense. And it goes like this. When Twailers and other critical international lawyers speak about the use of force regime, it is often in the register of its imperial implications and effects. The impression is that there is not much, if any, critical faith, Sandhya Pahuja's term, in this particular area of international law. But the title for this paper, Anti-Colonialism is Self-Defense, suggests a more affirmative stance. An affirmative stance that admittedly may have been more reasonable 50, 60 years ago than it is today. In this paper, I shall try to bridge this gap between the past and the present of the use of force regime to show both why the historical investment by the Third World in the use of force in international law was and still is significant, but also why use of force today is so imperialist. The The first part is then a reconstruction of a third world conception of use of force in international law. And this, of course, prompts a methodological question. So how can we learn about the third world conception of use of force? So where would we turn? As important as the UN Charter is in use of force, turning immediately to Article 2.4 or to San Francisco 1945 would clearly be the wrong place to look. The simple reason is that most, if not all, of African and Asian nations were not only excluded from global lawmaking at that point, but also unprotected by this norm. What I did instead was to turn to the diplomatic history of the 1970 Friendly Relations Declaration. So the question is, how can we think about what third world states wanted to do with the UN Charter generally and the use of force regime specifically in the context of the Friendly Relations Declaration? I think the Indian international lawyer V.S. Mani gives us a good hint when he in 1973 lauded the adoption of the Friendly Relations Declaration in the following term, and I quote, the declaration constitutes an all-important first step on the part of the international community as a whole towards the eventual formalization and crystallization of a process which had initially found expression in the Latin American challenge to traditional international law in the 19th century, later carried forward by the socialist and Asian African countries within the normative framework of the UN Charter. I find V.S. Mani's view on the Friendly Relations Declaration very helpful because of the long lines of continuity that he draws from Mestizo international law, that's Arnulf Becker Lorca, crystallizing in the Montevideo Convention's assertion of non-intervention in the 1930s. We can also see the connection with the Afro-Asian Bandung Conference in 1955, where the so-called Panchel principles privileged non-interference in other states' internal affairs and respect for territorial unity, integrity, and sovereignty. By adding socialist countries, we can also think of not just the Soviet Union, but also the Tricontinental Conference in Havana in 1966, a time at which liberation movements from 3 continents banded together in the face of intransigent resistance by the colonial powers. And this took place literally while the Friendly Relations Declaration was negotiated. If we draw these lines of continuity, we can see how even before the UN Charter, but certainly also after, non-intervention and non-use of force for these actors presented something like a minimum criterion for international law's break with its colonial past, and a way to sustain post-colonial states in the unequal world militarily and otherwise in which they emerged. Once the Charter was in place, these states and collectives, however, these states and collectives did not blanketly embrace the UN Charter, but became involved in a project of trying to radicalize the obligations stemming from the recently restructured international law of the UN Charter. These efforts culminated with the Friendly Relations Declaration, and as mentioned, use of force was a major stumbling block in the negotiations. A Swedish diplomat, in fact, by the name of Hans Blix, was the rapporteur for the negotiations, and in his elaborate summary reports, we can see colonial rule as such being described in use of force significant ways as, and I quote, permanent aggression against the territories of third world states. And furthermore, the negotiations took place in the mid to late 1960s at the height of the violent repression by colonial powers of the aspirations of people's right to freedom and self-determination, repression that was widely seen by third world delegates as unlawful threat or use of force prohibited by Article 2.4. And self-determination provided, of course, the normative base for this understanding. And having taken that step, there was but a very small step further to declare a right to self-defense against colonial domination, something that was important not least to be able to receive outside support without violating international law. So hence the notion of anti-colonialism is self-defense. What is also clear from the negotiations is that third world states sought to extend the notion of use of force in Article 2.4 to make it as prohibitive as possible, applicable not just to every form of military intervention, but equally to political and economic force. And this extension was in fact seen as entirely determinative for the success of the new international economic order, which took place at the same time, the negotiations on that. So there's of course much more to be said about the Friendly Relations Declaration and this historical era. But I want to come to the question how this legacy has fared in the time after 1970. And I think it's fair to describe the Friendly Relations Declaration as a relatively successful institutionalization of a third world use of force agenda. But what happened to this minimum criterion for international law's break with its colonial past between then and now? And here the paper takes a rather technical turn to the sources of international law as something of a root cause, legally speaking, to some of the problems that we've encountered. My instinct was that it's important to study these sources questions if we are to understand how third world interests have been sidelined or circumvented in use of force, especially after the end of the Cold War. Because we know, of course, that the major battles over use of force have never focused on the Friendly Relations Declaration or the subsequent definition of aggression for that matter. And interestingly, even the UN Charter itself often plays a marginal role in use of force debates, pushed in the background by customary international law. Olivier Courtin's monumental overview of use of force in international law from World War II to today in his book, The Law Against War, is a good starting point for understanding how this is possible. Based on extensive empirical material, Courtin outlines two fundamentally different methods of reaching conclusions on controversies over the lawfulness of state action in use of force. Actors favoring a prohibitive rule lean more towards the UN Charter itself, while accepting that neither source can be allowed to prevail over the other, and where General Assembly resolutions, among them the Friendly Relations Declaration, are referred to as indication of customary obligations. And actors favoring the legality of forceful intervention tend to rely primarily or solely on customary international law. Because customary international law is important for both, Courtin is very thorough in looking at state practice and opinio juris in his book. And Courtin's understanding of the formation of customary international law is such that the opinio juris that must be established requires as broad an analysis of state positions as possible. And accordingly, he affords a privileged status to the major UN General Assembly resolutions, the views of organizations or groups with large memberships, such as NATO, but also the Group of 77, which consists of more than 130 states, the non-aligned movement, more than 110 states, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, 57 states, regional organizations such as the OAS, the Rio Group, the European Union, the African Union, ASEAN, among others. What he finds is important, and he finds consistent resistance on the part of third world states and organizations, but also of socialist states during the Cold War, in relation to practically every doctrine impinging on third world sovereignty, including humanitarian intervention absent the Security Council authorization, think about Kosovo, a right to preventive war in self-defense, think about the war against terrorism, or implied authorization of use of force, think about the 2003 invasion of Iraq, to name but a few. In fact, it is odd, given the extensive support that he gathers for this position, that Courtin does not grant authorship to third world states and organizations for what he still sees as a genuine jus contra bellum, a law against war, a restrictive use of force regime, and the claim, of course, that we still have such a regime is the overarching argument of the book. And this is especially the case, this surprise that he doesn't grant authorship to these actors, because he's much more forthcoming in pointing out the actors that are undermining that system. And Courtin is also very clear about how we can account for the fact that permissive use of force doctrines are still around. It is due to the emphasis on and construction of customary law in this area. Put briefly, the only way to even consider the lawfulness of such practices, according to Courtin, is to exclude third world actors from consideration. and assign a dominant role to the practice of major, and in most cases, Western states. And this made me think about the role of customary law more generally in late colonial or not yet post-colonial international law, something that B.S. Chimney has written about recently. But rather than giving an account of what Chimney says, I wanted to illustrate a few aspects of his argument by looking at the recent case of an aggressive use of force doctrine with significant effect for North on South interventions, the so-called unable or unwilling doctrine. The unwilling or unable doctrine has already been discussed by critical international lawyers in terms of reloading the canon of colonial international law. This is Justin Desautels-Stein, or as, and I quote, closely replicating the standard of civilization that informed international legal theory and practice throughout the 19th century. This was Dina Tsuvala. But I was specifically interested in how this works in terms of customary law. In terms of customary law arguments, in the kind of everyday, almost pedestrian work of colleagues in this field. And Ashley Deek's influential article by the name Unwilling or Unable Toward a Normative Framework for Extraterritorial Self-Defense from 2011 is my case. And this is by far the most referenced article on unwilling or unable out there, and is extensively relied on in arguments trying to determine when states can intervene unilaterally on other states' territory in pursuit of a non-state group or third state where the territorial state did not consent to the operation. So I'm going to share my screen to look at an appendix to this article. I hope you can see it. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
excellent.
but we cannot read it. So if you can make it a bit.
Okay, I will make it a bit bigger. So you won't see the last couple, but I think you now can see it a bit better. Is that the case?
Yeah, I can read that.
Yeah, okay, that's good. Okay, so I want to bring out a few aspects of this. So this is the actual appendix to Ashley Deek's article. And I want to bring out a few aspects of it by drawing on B.S. Chimney's analysis of customary international law. So the first thing that we can note, and I ask you to look at dates. So this is the far right end of the column, or the fourth column, the date in which the so what she looks at here is state practice. So the year becomes important here. And the first thing that we can notice is that Deeks goes back nearly 2 centuries in search for state practice supporting the customary status of this doctrine. In other words, the pursuit of customary law is completely uninhibited by systemic changes in the international system brought about by the UN Charter and of course the process of national liberation and the decolonization of international law that I sort of broached earlier. And if you think of it, this is actually quite remarkable. So here we are, and I would count myself among them, critical international lawyers doing our best to kind of expose colonial legacies and structures. And there they are, in this case, an American legal academic, turning directly to the colonial era, looking for state practice, in customary law support for the content of international law today. And of course, Chimney points to something quite evident, here. That I would also like to point to. So in the colonial era, so during these times that she discusses in the 19th century, etc., customary law was of course exclusively made by a small group of mostly. What happened here? I had a paper. Yes, sorry. Customary law was, of course, just made by a very exclusive group of European states. But apparently, this presents more of an opportunity than a problem for scholars today who are eager to find customary support for the unwilling or unable doctrine. And on a related note, and with regard to how it's been possible today to keep this very exclusive group of states that can determine the content of customary international law, I want to turn to the role that Deeks gives to major states. And this is on the far left end of the column with the title Victim State. So here, because she says that it's important to look at what these states think about the unwilling or unable doctrine in particular. And doing that, she uses a completely kind of pragmatic, but also completely circular argumentation that goes like this. So if the factors regulating use of force are derived from the states that have the political power and military capacity to use force in other states' territory, they will be more effective because these same states have been allowed a role in shaping it. And you can look at the types of states that we have in the far end columns. Most of them are used to be colonial states, so we even go back to the 19th century, but in any case, major players in the international system. So, and I will end very soon, I can assure you. The third element concerns the downplaying of the opinion of what Deeks refer to as territorial states. So these are the states that are on the receiving end of these practices. So why should we not listen to them, you may ask? And here I want to bring in something that Shimni speaks about, namely the implications of the positivist separation of formal from material sources of custom, a distinction that has been raised and endorsed in both the ILC and ILA studies of customary international law. And Deeks relies on this separation in an argument about how Security Council debates usually involve political arguments and not legal ones. And this is what she says. So this is sort of what she uses to dismiss us from listening to these territorial states that you can see in this column. So she says the following: statements in the Security Council, in particular, often are strongly colored by the politics surrounding the uses of force, apartheid, colonialism, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for instance, for example, and may not reveal the actual legal views of states. So I see this as a reference to, this is essentially an accusation against these states that, what they do is to mix material and formal sources of customary law in order to, by being apparently, by relying on political statements primarily, not legal ones, to downplay their significance in the formation of customary international law. So I wrote the bottom line, and I think I've run out of time. But I think what I'm trying to do in this paper is, on the one hand, to speak to the kind of the historical significance of a third world kind of investment in questions of use of force. But I also want to speak about how we can move so far from the position that we could see with the Friendly Relation Declaration. And I found this kind of the turn to custom and the extremely problematic ways in which custom is constructed to be kind of an important, as I said, kind of root legal cause for many of the kind of more imperialist kind of doctrines of use of force today. Thank you. That's it for me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Marcus. Another really fascinating paper. Can I ask you to unshare your screen?
Oh, of course, of course.
Great. No. Okay, yeah. Cool. Thank you very much. So without further ado then, we're going to move swiftly on to Ali. Go ahead. Although you're currently muted. Hold on, let me unmute you. There you go.
Thank you. You've just taken away my primary excuse there for not giving a good talk.
Oh, you're going to give 20 minutes of muted paper.
Just to let you know, I haven't got any screen sharing to do, so don't need to worry about that. And I'm going to start with not quite an apology, but a recognition that my abstract made some quite wild promises of what I could cover in one paper or a 15-minute summary of it. I was going to explain the English school theory of international relations. I was going to map that onto international peace and security law, particularly the responsibility to protect. And then I was going to link it beautifully to the conference theme of rules and resistance. And trying to do that gave me a meltdown. So there's the only link to the conference theme that we have. So what I'm going to do probably in this time, all I can do, I think, is talk about English school theory and hopefully some bits of how I think that maps to international peace and security law, particularly the R2P, the responsibility to protect. And really, the key, it's going to be an argument that I want to make, but really I think it's a question for the listeners, is English school theory useful to international lawyers in providing a lens to analyse international peace and security law and a way to critique some of the rules? Because stemming from some international lawyers and international relations theorists grappling with kind of the nature of interdisciplinary research, there were some IR journal articles and symposia saying, oh yes, international relations and international law have a lot to offer each other. Here's my research agenda. And that research agenda was pretty much always IR theorists setting a list of questions that lawyers can answer, or a list of ways that lawyers can prove to IR theorists that international law is relevant. And international lawyers understandably responded with, we don't need to run around proving the value of our discipline to you. We're just going to go and do the research that we've always been doing. And I have a lot of sympathy for that international law position, but yet, for some reason, I'm still drawn to this link between IR theory and international law. And I think that's sometimes because the question about, is something legal or not, doesn't quite ask the question that I'm interested in, or it doesn't provide the fullness of answer that I want. So I'm drawn back to this link with international relations theory. And I hope that the English school offers a bit more of a nuanced approach and a way to kind of situate criticisms of the law. So I'm going to talk through English school theory and then talk a little bit about how I see that providing a useful explanation or a useful way to ask questions about particularly the responsibility to protect. So starting in around the 1960s, we have Martin White, who identified three traditions of thought, or three traditions of international theory that are always present in debates. And he describes these as being kind of interweaved like currents in a riverbed, rather than parallel train tracks that offer you opposing theories to pick from. So the way that he saw these strands of theory weren't in competition with one another, but they were just always present in international writing. And these three traditions of thought are what he called realism, rationalism, and revolutionism. So realism he associated with Machiavelli, although there are plenty of thinkers we could go to there. And the kind of classic strand of realism, early work, talks about the human nature being naturally self-interested. So we are naturally driven to pursue our own goals, or as state leaders, the national interest, selfishly without taking account of other people, or at state level without taking account of the interests of other states, and will use military force to pursue state interests. Moving on from classical realism, mainly to account for the possibility that not all humans are completely self-interested. You have Kenneth Walton's structural realism saying, well, forget about human nature, even if there are some good humans around. The anarchical nature of the global system, being without a sovereign, means that necessarily state leaders are always going to pursue state interests and maximize their own state's power. Another strand, the revolutionism strand, he associated with Kant, and the possibility of a world society of humankind, or a community of humankind, that moves beyond the kind of coincidence of organising ourselves into states. So key principles of this strands of thought, or key ways to recognise it, are the commitment to universality and to individualism. Individuals as the relevant unit of moral worth. And sitting nicely in between these two strands is what he called rationalism, not the same as IR rational institutionalism of more recent years, but rationalism that he associated with Grotius, and of course with international law. And this he described as states having moved beyond the total chaos and self-interested pursuit of purely state interests to the remarkable fact that states have managed to formulate some sort of order out of anarchy, and some sort of society, quite a thin society based on rules of coexistence that are, are in everybody's, or all state leaders' interests. So we've moved beyond pure kind of use of power and maximization of power to find some way of getting along that minimizes disorder and war. And international law is key for this strand of international thinking because it is interested in the rules by which we have mitigated anarchy. So these three strands, he says, are constantly woven together, and you can recognize these strands in all kind of international theorizing. And he was very certain that these strands weren't in conflict with each other, and they weren't kind of competing for perfect explanatory power of the whole of the sort of global relations. And as soon as, well, this is my paraphrasing, as soon as Martin White has set this out there, the next phase of development of English school theory is that we immediately turn to putting these three strands in conflict with one another. But it seems that looking at the way we are living, or in the sort of 70s and 80s, the way that seemed most relevant or most descriptively accurate at that time was to say, well, we are living in a society of states that have mitigated anarchy to some extent and found some sort of ordered coexistence with slowly rules beginning to outlaw the use of force. So we are present in a society of states, and we're not just always pursuing state interest, or there's at least a complexity to how state interest is constructed. And so there became an interest in looking further at what are the rules of this international society. How much is it just about a very minimal coexistence and the agreement not to go to war? And how much is there a kind of thicker sense of shared values and cooperation in this society of states? And here we have one of the main pieces of work was Hedley Bull's Anarchical Society. And he set out two different accounts of what this society of states might look like. And he described these as pluralist society of states, or solidarist, or pluralism and solidarism. And he took these from international law writings. So he based pluralism on his reading of the work of Oppenheim and legal positivism. And his description of a pluralist international society was quite a pessimistic and a pragmatic approach to what he saw at the time in the 70s, in the 1970s mainly, as the limits of states' ability to kind of get on board with any sort of progressive ethical view. So this thin coexistence is all we can hope for, or all that we can realistically achieve, even if we might all dream of this cosmopolitan, revolutionist world society of humankind. So it was a descriptive aspect of his work. And some people talk about pluralism and realism together as the same thing. But I just want to note here that pluralists have more time for international law than realists do. So there is a difference between the two. And then this pluralist vision of a thin coexistence, very limited set of shared values, is set against what Bull called solidarism, which he based on Lauterpacht's work on Grotius and natural law. So we live in a society of states. We're not in a world society of humankind, whatever that means. We are in a society of states, but we can see the value of the individual within this society of states, and we can judge international rules on how much good they do to individuals. And we are maybe moving towards this solidarist society of states. So every new institution or organisation that is formed to deal with a global problem provides solidarists with evidence that we are working together cooperatively and we're not just about a minimalist banning of war. And this particularly came out, the sort of success for solidarism can be seen at the end of the Cold War and the supposed triumph of liberalism. So this again provides kind of evidence that solidarism was achievable in practice. It wasn't just a nice idea or an aim that we couldn't achieve because we were stuck in this pluralist coexistence. So some of the things that people point towards as evidence that we are living in or moving towards a solidarist international society are all the classic things that we all, I'm sure, have studied. So the functioning of the Security Council broadening after the end of the Cold War. So a wider range of things counting as a threat to international peace and security, threats to individuals in states, being justified as a threat to international peace and security because maybe there'd be regional instability or something. The renewed interest in peacekeeping and the change in the kind of quality and type of peacekeeping operations. So an increasing amount of enforcement powers being given to peacekeeping operations rather than just monitoring ceasefires and being very consent-based. You see the ability to enforce the mandate, and that mandate sometimes being protection of civilians. Or increasing breadth of peacekeeping operations, human rights training, judiciary training, rule of law training, kind of governance of post-conflict societies sometimes. So this idea that theoretically and practically solidarism is being realised in the Society of States. And writing in the 1990s, Andrew Hurrell pointed out this tension in solidarist thinking between or about how this thicker consensus on values comes about. So is it just a beautiful coincidence that states are suddenly all more inclined to share these values of individualism? Or is there an issue of coercion here, where it's not really about we all coincidentally share more individualist values, but we need to question how these values are being spread and forced into sort of unpleasant universalism rather than a happy coincidence that we're all moving towards some kind of Kantian community. And there, you can make a lot of critiques of cosmopolitanism and the Kantian strand. And I'm not going to do that now. I want to accept for the moment that there is some merit in cosmopolitan arguments about global distributive justice, for example. So people like Simon Caney and Charles Beitz writing on our global duties to redistribute wealth throughout the world. And as pluralism is associated kind of negatively with realism in these three strands, so is solidarism associated with this revolutionist cosmopolitan influence on the Society of States. And something that I think is problematic about this is maybe inevitably because we're in a society of states, we're not in whatever this imagined cosmopolitan world society is. That solidarism, as it plays out, isn't really cosmopolitan, or it doesn't take on important features of cosmopolitanism like global distributive justice. Solidarism is really liberalism. And some authors, like Andrew Hurrell, call it liberal solidarism because he accepts that there could be solidarity around a load of different possible ways of organising the world or different values. but what we currently have is a claimed value consensus around liberal principles. So, for example, a focus on what justice means within states. So rules' work on what that looks like, and the categorization of decent peoples and non-decent peoples according to how the government treats its own citizens. And visions of international justice in liberal solidarism are quite limited to judging a state as good or bad, rather than asking what duties we all have across borders. So more of a liberal than a cosmopolitan theory. And solidarist writing tends to endorse liberal peace theory, or not necessarily specifically address liberal peace theory, but subscribe to the same sort of construction of these kind of good and bad states. So, well, democracies don't fight other democracies, so we just need to convert all of the non-democracies to democracies, and then everything will be okay, rather than saying, these democratic states seem to be quite intolerant and violent in other parts of the world. Why is that? Should we ask questions about that? And humanitarian intervention was a kind of key thing that solidarists write about. So taking this kind of post-Cold War turn to individual values and this supposed consensus around individual values, there's a lot of solidarist writing on humanitarian intervention and the importance of intervening in supreme humanitarian emergencies, which was the phrasing of Nicholas Wheeler, who wrote a book, Saving Strangers, in 2000. So a little bit before R2P came in and kind of developed a particular set of phrases and language. This idea before mass atrocities was supreme humanitarian emergencies. But you can see the same sort of thing playing out in the responsibility to protect. So there's a bad state that's failing to protect its people. And that used to be described as the state being unable or unwilling to protect its people. And that changed to a state manifestly failing to protect its people. And I'm not sure why, but I find it interesting that this phrasing used to kind of be the same, unable and unwilling, and that's not so much the case now. There's a bad state that's failing to protect its people. The good states are appalled and can put varying levels of pressure on this bad state to stop. So they can try diplomacy, they can encourage the bad state to sign the ICC statute, they can undertake human rights training, they can make overseas aid conditional on not committing atrocities. There's all these things that good states can do. But there is very limited inquiry into the nature of these good states and how they are already implicated in the problems that arise in the bad states. So the arms trade, capital flight and instability, Cold War debts, IMF restructuring, the relationship between poverty and inequality and violence, and these international communities' role in perpetuating inequality and poverty. So that's my whistle-stop tour of the English school, and my last page of notes is entitled, So What? So this is a sort of rhetorical question, really, of does the English school add anything to a critique of R2P or international peace and security law and the arguments about that, the changes in that law? Does it add anything to existing critiques of liberalism and international law? I think it does, but I'm finding it hard to pin down. So I'm hoping to throw that as an open question to the audience. I think there's something about seeing the three traditions interweaved that might help. So you can identify arguments that are claimed as cosmopolitan and human-centered. You can identify aspects of realism in those arguments, maybe. So there's something there about Martin White's work that might help. Or just unpicking the construction of solidarism as this benign, coincidental sharing of values versus the kind of coercive spread of a particular brand of individualism. And my final idea is what might be the solution, or what can the English school offer? And that's to go back to pluralism, having set out what the problems are with solidarism as a very particularist version of universality, is to say, well, what about pluralism then? Is it really this pragmatic, negative, realist influenced description of a society of states that has no room for moral progress? Or could it be a celebration of diversity and toleration as a good in itself? So instead of going guns blazing into some situation where there may be a risk of atrocities, you might look at your own role in this global system and how that's led there. And there is some work on recreating pluralism as a more ethical theory in its own right by John Williams, who uses the work of Hannah Arendt on kind of diversity and the celebration of diversity in humankind. And so that's where I'd kind of like to take this work. I will stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ali. I would say keeping to time, but I've actually not been taking note of the timing, so I'm sure you did, but yeah, anyway, great paper. Christiana, then, I'll leave it open to you to offer whatever amount of discussion as discussant you'd like to do. So over to you for the final word.
Thank you very much for the invitation to discuss, and thank you for the great papers. So just to clarify, I'm just offering comments on the basis of the presentations we have all heard. The three papers, and I know it was a planned panel, have really nice overlaps and sort of areas where we can kind of discuss them against each other. I don't want to take too much time just to point out some connections. Thompson Chenget's very, very engaging paper on the problematics of killer robots or other forms of technologically mediated violence that have become more or less independent from human judgment, very helpfully relates those technologies to the racism and the use of violence that we're already seeing, and that we have seen pretty much live on TV in different forms yesterday and over years, actually. And there's so much to be said about this. So one way thought about approaching is to ask, like, what do killer robots not have what we think a soldier should have? And two of those things, and this is really about a question of what it means to be human. Two elements that seem really important is, like, one is bodily vulnerability. Like a killer robot doesn't feel pain in the same way that we do. And the second one is having a conscience and judgment. And so the irony that in some way was already there in the paper is that, so they're all good reasons for being against killer robots, and I'm not denying that, but the problem is that the situation we're in without killer robots is also really messed up. So the bodily vulnerability of the people who are fighting, if you're looking at drone strikes, is close to zero. Right, so I'm not saying they might as well be robots, but it's not the idea that that you helpfully started with, that violence used to be among humans, which also means kind of a mutual exposure and vulnerability to each other, by the virtue of incorporating different technologies that again are only accessible to certain states, certain societies, has already been transformed into very asymmetrical relations between very technologized remote violence and absolute exposure without the possibility of defending yourselves for people living under drones and bombs, among other things. So in a way, the killer robots would be extending this to ground warfare. If I'm not sure if that's a fair thing to say. And also, if you look at the question of conscience and judgment, I mean, again, turn on the TV news, look what's going on in the States about the absolute absence of any reasonable judgment about the use of violence on the part of many humans whose task it should be to exercise it, to exercise judgment. And there have been always arguments, which I think are tricky to deal with, that actually we could program a robot to be less emotional, less racist than the individual cops or soldiers who might be out there to enjoy violence, because a robot would not be enjoying violence the same way that some humans do. Again, so I'm not sure that this would be an argument for saying yay robot, but I think that the complexity and the way this is troubling is because like all the arguments against robots make perfect sense. It's only that the situation without the robots is already in a place where, I'm not saying it's hard to see how it could be worse. It could always be worse. That and also the question of accountability. It's also true, and it's interesting that one of the key arguments that's been brought out, not in your presentation, but kind of in the media, is that, yeah, you can like put a robot in jail. I mean, you can, it just doesn't make any sense. But then the way that the human is demanded in warfare and violence is as a body to be able to be punished. And that's quite interesting. So it's not necessarily the judgment, but the possibility of punishment that that's demanded. Now, from our joint studies on accountability for airstrikes, we can tell you there's like literally zero. So it is literally hard to imagine, or possible to imagine, that there would be less accountability if a robot calls in a strike than if the humans do, because there's already nobody going to prison. Again, this is not an argument that there isn't anything to outsourcing responsibility to robots that's problematic. It's just, it's already, the exception of technologically mediated violence is already advanced to a degree that even with the participation of humans, we have many of the characteristics. And so, well, you just made somebody else the host? Okay, I think we lost the chair. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought a tiny bit. Yeah, so, oh no, like I think one theoretical question that's open is if we need to let go a tiny bit, or if there would be a point in letting go a tiny bit of the differentiation between human and technology, because we kind of clearly humans create the technologies, and the technologies kind of co-constitute the violence with us in many ways. So this is going in the direction of work on the post-human, on Donna Haraway, about the sort of the ways in which human and technology are not separate categories. So I think this is a theoretical way I can imagine this ways going. But anyways, it's like super interesting and obviously very important paper on an important question, and slightly concerned that we lost Max. But he had bad internet connection in the last panel I was with him, so I hope he's coming back. Anyway, so Marcus's paper is using a very different approach and looking at like what are third world states' conceptions of the use of force. And as with many other questions of international legal history, there is a really important methodological question of like, where do you go? And I might add that even looking at the question of third world states as opposed to societies or nations, hey, welcome back, Max, might be kind of buying into a certain system. But that's obviously one of the key ways in which international law is structured is that who gets to speak and who gets to be counted as a participant, as a collectivity, is quite problematic. And I think it's been often observed that kind of smaller, weaker, and like very much connection to Thompson's paper, that small and weaker societies would have a lot of self-interest in not allowing intervention because they're very unlikely to be able to do it, right? So that the ability to use force, the legalization of that will always benefit actors that are actually capable of doing it. So there's this interplay between technical universality in a rule, but actually quite uneven use, because some people will be much more afraid to be living under the violence than actually to be able to say, So like, this is a really important thing. I can try it in my daily life. And one of the issues that I think goes through all the papers is the question of how do we tell the history of our planet? How do we talk about what custom is in the cases of Marcus' paper, and the way the provincialism of talking about the perspectives of very particular countries, which again is also then underwritten by lots of academic production that exists on the perspectives of those countries, that, you know, there are lots of diplomatic notes and papers. So there are lots of sources of the kind that we're used to reading that help us privilege them, which maybe isn't something we should do. And the table that you showed from the article is just mind-blowing. There's so much in there. I think I counted 2 states that might not actually be colonial powers, like Colombia, which I'm not sure about in that context, but it was like post-revolutionary, and Rwanda. And also for some reason, the state that should have been called the Soviet Union, which is definitely imperial, was called Russia. Like, there's so much going on in that table. And as you said, and even the labeling of the columns is super, is very clear. In all the colonial states are being called victim states. And right, so it's like, how are these states victims of Mexican bandits? So it's basically a litany of colonial violence that we have here that's presented as we're being terribly aggrieved by these like people, small groups of people wearing bandanas that for some reason we can't get a hold of. Yeah, so in a way, I was kind of writing that note. It's really about customary colonialism, and the way this like those ways of relating and of dominating and of using violence have become so normal that they're still being referred to as just like as good examples of behavior that constitutes a customary international law. And this connect, you know, I think this perspective connects very, very well to all these excellent people in the English school, which I've learned some of it when I was in New York, with Andrew Val. And it really struck me now when you were telling like how incredibly provincial it is. You know, how there's not even a mention of other organized societies that have had diplomatic relationships for centuries, possibly much longer. You know, I live in North America, and we're learning more and more about the confederacies that have been going on for a very long time, largely very peaceful, transcontinental, you know, trade across the entire continent, and also ideas about what it means to live a good life and to have good relationships that are very different from anything in that. So it's not even like how do you map indigenous theory on these 2 schools? It's completely outside. It's not even speaking the same language. And again, the privilege that allows entire schools of theory to characterize the international order solely from the perspective of a few states in the global north and west is quite astonishing. Shouldn't be at this point, but I think not losing the sense of how particular this is, kind of not allowing ourselves almost on the mode that the Ashley Diggs piece seems to be doing, saying, oh, this is normal, this is just life. Because we only have one history to draw on. We don't have an alternative from which we can say, oh, this is actually strange. Yeah, so I think kind of this is where I'd like to kind of to end this with. So there I think all 3 papers really thematize the way rules are formulated and the way histories are invoked in a very partial way in order to justify certain kinds of rules. We can talk about you know, physical or what we think of as classical technologies of violence, but we can also think about the law as a technology of violence, of justifying certain kinds of very violent relations. And I would just like to leave it at that.
Great, thank you so much, Christiane. Unfortunately, my internet broke halfway through your response. So I only heard half of it, but I've managed to come back to finish things off. So what I'll do now is I'll unmute everyone.
Yep.
So if any of you would like to, any of the panelists, first of all, would like to say anything in response to what Christiane said, then perhaps we could start a discussion that way. No? Okay. Oh, Thompson, go for it.
Thank you very much, Max. I just wanted to perhaps reiterate some of the important points that have been said by the discussion team here. In particular, maybe 2 points, in particular, the issue of, that relates to the question whether, for example, robots can do better. That question stemming from the idea that already in the battlefield, already in the law enforcement situations, the things are not good. The situation is already bad. I think there are already scholars, for example, like Ron Akin. I think he wrote some article sometime in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, which was explaining where he said the plea of the nanny-combatant, trying to say that, perhaps robots, because they do not have feelings, because they don't have the prejudices which humans may have in committing those crimes, perhaps robots would do better. In that regard, I would agree first to begin with that, the situation is already bad. Humans are already doing terrible things on the battlefield. I have doubts, however, on the suggestions, for example, that perhaps robots, because they lack emotions, they may do better. That because technically, in terms of what is possible to program into robots, I don't think, as far as situational awareness, which is integral, for example, in complying with rules of law enforcement, that it is possible at the present moment for one to be able to program that into a machine. So if anything, technical-wise, I think letting robots be able to decide when to use force against women with what severity will only perhaps result in something that is worse. So I understand, for example, the example which she gave when she talked about airstrikes, to say, in terms of airstrikes, it may be difficult to give an accountability, but an understanding of, for example, how an airstrike against a particular target, be it human or non-human, is that there is coordination in the military. There's people who are on the ground, confirming, for example, that this is a military target, you need to target it, and providing those coordinates to whoever is the pilot. So in that scenario, I think, in my understanding, the decision making as to who deserves to be in the adversarial status, or who is a legitimate target, who is a lawful target to be targeted, the decision is still being made by a human. And this means that as far as the decision is still being made by a human, you can still be able to hold that particular individual accountable for ensuing it. And the issue will be different where, for example, those decisions are now being made by machine. And finally, which is the last point, the second point, so to say, totally right on the issue of smaller states. Just as a sort of an addition, when I was talking about smaller states or those affected when involved in these discussions being had, what they're saying about killer robots. I'll give you an example. You might have heard, Max, of the United Nations group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems that have been having meetings on this issue of autonomous weapon systems. Their last meeting of the UNGGE, there was this discussion where in the reports of the chair of that group, particularly in the morning report, because I was participating in this, they included a paragraph, I think it was paragraph 19, in the morning of that discussion, where they said, bias in algorithms and etc. may contribute to the worsening of racial discrimination and other social imbalances, so to say. That paragraph was there. And no one during the discussion in the morning was actually opposing the inclusion of that paragraph in that report. Later in the evening, that paragraph disappeared. And we had smaller states, which I don't want to mention names here, 2 or 3 of them who raised their placards specifically asking why that particular paragraph had removed from the report, the 2019 report, end of 2019, so to say, of the UNGGE. And the chair could not give any satisfactory answer. And none could explain why they are willing to have that paragraph removed. I understand, perhaps maybe bigger states will be thinking the issues of race, issues of intersectionality, maybe some sort of a conversation stopper. But you begin to feel as if then that even within the states themselves who are trying to decide on the policies or the way forward, perhaps the voices of smaller states, the voices of those who may be coming from, for example, people of color or smaller nations coming from certain regions are not really paid attention to, or whatever they are saying doesn't have any weight, so to say.
Cool. Thank you, Thompson. So yeah, Ali or Marcus, did you have anything that you wanted to add, or perhaps we could open it up to questions if you're happy? Okay, great. So anyone in the audience, you're all muted. I'm going to unmute you so you can, so I can, oh, it's not working. Okay, if you want to ask a question, unmute yourself and start talking. I think that's going to be the way forward. Cool. Getting flashbacks to seminars that I gave earlier in the year when we first entered lockdown.
I mean, so I have a question for some of my fellow panelists, if that would be of interest.
Yeah.
Okay. So first, Thompson, and I should just say first that I enjoyed hearing your paper, and I share many of, if not all, of your concerns. And I think one thing that was, I think where you ended with this, I think was really fascinating, this kind of inside stories of how these negotiations takes place. And I've been wanting to read this kind of stuff, but haven't really found it. So it's just an encouragement to if you are not already writing about that, I think please do. I think this is hugely significant, and there's so much talk about autonomous weapon systems, etc. But I think to actually to tell these stories. So who's actually there when these things are decided, and this kind of detailed account of who gets to speak, what voices are not heard, the kind of in these institutional settings, I think was really fascinating and something that I would like to hear more about. And I was in relation to that, I was thinking about, you used the word discrimination in these contexts, and I wasn't sure if you meant that in a kind of in a straightforward legal way, or if you used it in a more general sense, because I mean, so that's one way of getting at this. Of course, I mean, if there are rules prohibiting discrimination of any kind, I don't think that's true in many of these instances. But if there were, I mean, that would be one way of getting at some of these concerns from a legal perspective. But yeah, so I was just thinking about your use of discrimination in this context, and if that had a kind of a strong legal meaning, or if it was a more general question. But yeah, I leave it at that. I had a question for Alexandra as well, if no one else.
Some questions, but I think as chair, I should definitely defer to you if you've got one. Then yeah, go ahead.
Okay. No, so I also enjoyed your paper, and I was wondering. So you seem to have turned to the English school. So you said early on that you were sort of the meagerness of international legal discourse, and this kind of is it legal or not type questions was dissatisfactory. So you thought there was something in the English school that you could, and particularly this kind of meta theory of international law would seem to be what you got from the English school. And I was wondering if there would be something in perhaps by having something to compare with from international law. So, you know, to have some kind of counterpoint that comes from international law to compare this kind of in the English school meta theorizing with. And I was thinking something that is not, you know, does not reflect the kind of the meagerness of this, the international lawyer speaking about stuff which is legal or not. And something that can sort of capture international law in more sophisticated ways. So, I mean, perhaps something, yes, something to bring in there by way of comparison. And I was thinking about, for instance, Sandhya Pahuja's ideas of international law as a law of encounter. I was also thinking about Martti Koskiniemi's culture of formalism. Is that not what he calls it? So I'm not, I mean, of course you would be aware of these things, but I'm thinking in terms of what you seem to be working on, it could be interesting by way of, so what kind of stories are they able to tell, which, you know, is also this kind of meta theorizing about international law, but taking the position of the international lawyer and not the IR. So what can we say then? Because I think they both kind of would sort of resist, you know, they do something else than the IR theorists, right? Because they would consider themselves to be jurists. So what kind of meta theorizing can you do about international law if you bring in those kind of, yeah, so that was just a few questions.
Great, thank you, Marcus. So, Thompson, do you want to respond first?
Thank you very much, Marcus, for the very helpful questions. Actually, in particular, when you ask how I'm dealing with the term discrimination, whether I'm, you know, dealing with it as a concept where we're only focusing on the legal definition of what constitutes discrimination. I would say that I'm taking actually a broad approach where, for example, I start by dealing with the obvious unlawful discrimination in terms of, for example, legal treaties or international law treaties or human rights treaties that define what discrimination is. For example, where there is a clear discrimination on the basis of race, on race, so to say. I'll give you an example which I deal with in the paper, is to articulate how, for example, within the US, they passed a law which said may not target a citizen of the United States using armed drones, like there was law and the policy which they pass along those lines. And then when that person happened to be Muslim, you know, the case of Anwar, I don't know if you're afraid about it. When that person happened to be Muslim and is a US citizen, there is now shifting of goalposts, not only within the administration, but within even the discourse of society discussing whether that targeted killing was legal. So the question of where there is existence of law, where there's clear terms defining what unlawful discrimination is, there's still shifting of goalposts when it comes to certain regions, so to say. But I then go broader to look at other societal, ethical, and regional considerations, which I feel perhaps may not, clearly fit within the legal definition what discrimination is. But I want to use the term, you know what it is, where I would be asking the question. Remember when I asked the question, like, is the war which you're trying to wage just to begin with? So instead of simply asking the question to say you are targeting persons of a certain these persons of certain beliefs or in certain regions, your reasons which you are giving to the international community for why you are targeting those regions, are they actually just reasons? And this is a broader, question which I'll be asking. So my introduction to that part, actually, I started by looking where I'm saying the development or the use of weapons has always been about domination. It's about continued domination. And I'll be questioning to say, do we need, for example, at this particular time, are these weapons necessary? Do we really need them? There are other pressing humanity needs which are there. Why exactly? What is driving states to want to develop these weapons? You know? So when you see the agenda that is behind that, whatever, that's a bigger question beyond actually the issue of legal definition. So Marcus, I would actually want to thank you that in case I wasn't maybe perhaps making it more clear in my paper, I would try actually to be more specific to say, whilst I'm considering the legal definition, I'm considering also at a broader level life is about actually in relation to these particular weapons. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think it's my turn. So thank you for the question. And I think that I might have sounded overly dismissive about international law as a discipline and international lawyers, hearing you tell me what you heard me say. And it's not quite what I meant, that that's the only thing that I think international lawyers offer. It's more that that's how I read some of the international relations theorists setting the agenda for interdisciplinary work with lawyers.
Fair enough, fair enough.
But I think it's an important point that my route of sort of dealing with that is to say, well, I still want this dialogue between IR and IL, so maybe the English school offers an alternative way to do that. That isn't necessarily the right answer, and there are other answers, and international lawyers who refuse to engage in the conversation when the agenda has been set in a way that already kind of minimalizes the contribution of international law is maybe a better response, and I have a lot of respect for that response. And I have encountered some of Sundhya Pahuja's work before, but not the meta theory element, so I'm absolutely going to go and look at that. But I did enjoy, I think it was 1999, I think the American Journal of International Law had a symposium on methods, and they gave a little scenario that I think was something about internal conflicts and human rights breaches. And they invited people who were emblematic of a particular approach to explain how this approach would see this problem. And I read this symposium thinking, this is really going to help me sort out my methodology for my PhD thesis. And then one of the contributions was Koskiniemi, and he'd just written a letter to the editors when he was asked to contribute, pretty much saying this is an absolute load of rubbish. You can't take a school science project approach to these complex things, and I'm not going to participate in this form of violence. And I have a lot of respect for that. So maybe my answer is that I am going down a path that isn't particularly useful, and my kind of enthusiasm for this IR-IL dialogue is not going to go anywhere if I approach it from IR. I don't know, but I appreciate the question.
But so just to prohibit potential misunderstanding, I didn't mean at all that this was not leading anywhere. But what I tried to suggest was that, you know, perhaps you could gain a better understanding of both what's, you know, the IR people, how they think about international law by, you know, comparing it with something equivalent, as it were, something of that kind of meta theorizing about international law, taking the role of the jurist. So perhaps you could, you know, learn something about both by, you know, comparing, you know, the English school people with, you know, Pahuja and Koskiniemi. I was just suggesting that. I wasn't at all saying that this road leads to nowhere. Just to be very clear.
But thank you. Yeah, I appreciate the nuance.
Fantastic. Okay, we've got a few more minutes left. Any audience questions before I barrel in?
I've got one, if I might.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Greatly enjoyed the panel. I think my question is mostly about the English school, but maybe not limited to it. All three papers I thought made really important points about the presumption, let's say, of who these states are that precedes international decisions, whether it's the use of drones, whether it's the use of robots, whether it's which countries believe they can invade the territory of other countries in pursuit of third actors, or certainly the labeling of countries as failed as opposed to unwilling or unable, right? And in each case, it's important who the countries are that are occupying the different roles. And so the question, I guess, about the English school in particular is, what does it really have to say, if I could call it the global North and the global South? What does it really say about those relations? Is there a way that it can be or has been applied to offer some account of how the global South might seek to function as a starting point, or how we might understand North-South relations? And I would also throw that question about critical international law, which I'm a newcomer here, so I don't know enough of what that is. How would that actually specifically think about the question of North-South relations and accounting for actors? And I'm sort of thinking here out loud that some kind of constructivism seems necessary to be able to begin to fill in what those relationships are, or Wallerstein or something, but let me stop there.
Thank you. Really interesting question. I don't think that the English school does offer much of an account of the global South. And I think maybe it was of its time in the 1960s and 70s. And it could have faded away. It started out as something called the British Committee that was set up to consider matters of international relations, because there was a US committee doing the same thing. And it maybe could have just stopped there after publishing one round of papers. And it did fade away. And it was in the 80s and 90s that it got revived. Maybe that was a mistake, because one of the criticisms you can make of it, not just from the name, but it's a clue, is that it is quite a parochial theory with visions of grandeur, maybe. So I don't think that it does offer that account.
Cool. I couldn't think if you'd frozen there, Ali, or...
Run out of
all right. We've got 1 minute left.
Perhaps, should I say something? I think there was something in it, possibly for me as well.
Okay, yeah, go for it. Definitely.
What critical international law and what it has to say about North-South relations. I think something that has happened relatively recently in critical international law is a kind of increasing attention to questions of history. And I think this is, in a way, the broader church of critical international law has been very influenced by a kind of a more historical orientation to our field, and has also been very much kind of influenced by what I refer to as TWAIL, so third world approaches to international law. That has sort of I think had a wider impact on critical international lawyers, that had this kind of effect that it's impossible to think about international law without accepting that colonialism was and still is fundamentally part of the international legal system. And so I think if you would have asked that question I don't know, 20 years ago, critical international law, the typical critical international lawyer would have less to say about North-South relations than what they have today. So I think, and largely due to, particularly the influence of third world approaches to international law.
Fab. Okay, well, I think unless there's any urgent final words, we'd better leave it there. Oh, you've raised your hand, Marcus.
I did raise my hand.
That was an accident.
That was only to say thank you to Max and Alexandra for putting this together, and also to Christiane for giving wonderful comments. So I just want to say that I didn't want to steal your.
No, you steal away. That's fine. Well, I will say similar things. Panelists, thank you so much. it feels like those papers were perfectly planned in that there was, there were themes that ran through each of them. There were real synergies there. But it was a question of sort of luck. But I'm really pleased, and I thought they were all absolutely enjoyable. And Christiana, thank you so much for being our discussant. Really impressive thoughts shared there. I don't know how discussants are able to do such an incredible job. I hope I'm never asked to be a discussant because I'll be rubbish at it. And thank you also for our audience. I have loads of questions about this, but I think perhaps over time we'll just discuss them, hopefully face to face, but perhaps I might email some of you, maybe. And ask that way. Thanks, audience, for coming, and to everyone else. Well, there is no one else, is there? To all of you, I guess that's the end of the panel. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah.
And yeah, at this point, we'd rise and leave and go and get coffee. But, you can just leave the room if you want.
Thank you so much.
Or you can just hang out and chat.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
See you
Bye-bye.
later, everyone. I'll speak to you soon.